Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and just like last week, we've got a level up episode coming at ya, one that I feel that's been a long time coming. It's a big picture approach of how to get the most out of 17lands.com. And I say that this one is a long time coming, not just because we've had 17 lands, this awesome tool that I think players of basically any skill or experience level can get something out of, and I haven't done a proper level up episode of how to use it just yet, but also I just get a ton of questions, almost daily at this point, from people wanting to know how to best use 17 lands and how I use 17 lands and, what metrics you want to look at when you're looking at the card data. And also, there's a lot of misconceptions or traps that I commonly see people falling into. So hopefully, I'll be able to answer some of those questions and also clear up some of those misconceptions. Before we get any further, I'm sure most of you watching and listening will be familiar with 17lands.com. Some of you may use it. Some of you may have just heard about it on a podcast or a video. I mean, I reference it almost every episode at this point. But for those who haven't heard about it before, maybe you're a bit confused when they hear about it, 17lands.com is a website whose main purpose is to track Magic Arena gameplay and draft data. It's mostly for limited players. And then on their website, they display that data in various helpful ways. It's very similar to Untapped GG or other arena trackers, but it's mostly pointed towards limited players almost exclusively, hence the 17lands.com name. And it's an opt-in experience. Anyone can join to have their games or drafts tracked. And so if you're not on it already, I'm going to be covering today also some of the reasons why I think anybody looking to get better at limited Magic will likely want to opt into it. There are a lot of things that I want to talk about regarding this website today, but I want to keep it as practical and as approachable as possible. So it's going to be pretty application based, or I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum of just throwing out numbers and letters and names and stuff. We're going to be talking about some abstract and complex topics too. It's kind of impossible to avoid that to some degree, but I've narrowed down what I want to talk about today, and I have a few goals in mind. So I want to highlight how I use 17 lands, specifically as somebody who does not have a math background, is not particularly math or data minded. I want to talk about the features that I use the most often and the ones I found the most valuable. Second up, I want to demystify and uncomplicate the website. Honestly, that might be my #1 goal here today. I know when you first go on, it can be pretty intimidating. Again, especially if you're like me and a non-data minded person, there's all these charts and tabs and graphs and numbers and letters. It's really not that complicated. I promise you it isn't that complicated once you just have somebody tell you what's going on and why the things are there and what they're telling you. So that, if anything, I hope to make it a little bit easier to navigate and understand what's happening. The third thing I want to cover today is important metrics when you're looking at that card data, that card performance data, looking how well cards do in a format. There's about, 10 metrics that 17 Lands provides you: game in hand win rate, opening hand win rate, average last seen at in the draft. Navigating those and knowing which ones are the most important, which of those metrics have some traps you can fall into, that's something I really want to touch on. Number 4, I want to highlight what I think are the most important features on 17 lands, not just that card analysis, that data, game, hand, win rate, all that stuff. There's a lot of tools on 17 lands aside from just that card analysis. I want to get into those. And number 5, I do want to highlight some cautions that I have, some traps you might fall into, some traps I've seen people fall into using 17lands.com. But with that, I also want to vouch for 17lands.com and its importance and why I think it's such a great tool. I know there are some data naysayers out there, and I've heard the argument, so I kind of want to put some of them not necessarily to rest, but I want to give my side of the argument to let you make your own decision, basically. So yeah, just like a ton to talk about today, and I do want to say, just before we jump into it, I have a lot of faith in 17 lands. I use it a lot. If you couldn't tell already from my intro, I use it all the time, and I do think if you're using it in the ways that I'm going to suggest today, your win rate will improve to some degree. And of course, just before I do jump in, just want to shout out the Patreon very quickly, patreon.com/limitedlevelup. So you can go there if you like the show, if you learned something, like what we're doing here, feel like you'll want a few more drafts, go check it out. That's patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Thank you everybody so much for those who support each and every single week. Really does help the show keep on going. So go check it out if you're interested. All right, and with all that out of the way, let's jump into our main topic here, starting with the question, what are the main 17lands.com features? Pretty broad, but I think it's important to start out when you go onto the website. Maybe it's even your first time. What are you looking to get out of it? What are the big draws to visiting this website? And I think there's 2 main ones. The first one being card and archetype performance data. This is generally what you think of when you hear people referencing 17 lands data. They're saying, oh, you can look and see what the top commons are, what the top uncommons are, all that kind of stuff. But we're not going to start there, actually. We're going to start on the second feature, the 2 big features, I think. That's the first one. The second big feature, and one that I use quite a bit, especially in coaching and on the Discord, is game and draft tracking. And this is where you can look back at your previous drafts, at your previous games, do some review, and there's quite a bit I think you can get out of this feature if you're looking to improve. One thing to note just before we get into the thick of things, for people that are listening on the podcast feed audio only, I do have a few more visuals on this episode than I usually do. Not so much that I think it's going to be difficult to follow along with, but if you are somebody who has a little bit of a tough time with audio, it might help to go check out the YouTube version of this podcast if there's a few sections that are a little bit confusing when you're trying to navigate the website. As we're talking through this, I'm going to be actually navigating through the website to tell you where to find all these features and the best ways to use them. Okay, so currently I am on my own personal event history page, and this is where if you are somebody who has the 17 lands tracker, it's going to track all of your decks, all of your drafts that you've drafted, and you can go back and look through every single pick, all of your games that you've played, and you can go back and watch every single turn. If you are familiar with MTGO and the replays that they have on MTGO, it's a very similar system to this, where you can go back and look at every single turn of your previous games, and constructed too. By the way, this is a feature that maybe not a lot of people know, but you can track your constructed games as well and look at them, even though 17 lands is mostly a limited thing. Just go to the My Data tab at the top, go to Game History, and you'll actually see all of your games, constructed or limited ones. This is the part of the website that is opt-in. You do need to download the tracker. It's very simple to download the tracker. They have it right here on the website. Costs no money. If you're instead just interested in looking at the card data, where every card in the format is matching up with every other, top commons, top uncommons, you don't have to sign up, but it's pretty low opportunity cost to sign up. I would recommend it. So just some cursory things with this event history page. Number one, if you would like to share your event history with a friend or on Discord, somebody's looking over your game logs or your draft logs, there's a little button up here, top of the page, just says event history, that opens up a new link. That's a shareable link. You can send it to anybody. And by the way, quick shout out here, if you'd like my 17 lands event history of every single game I've ever played on Arena, you want to see how I'm drafting certain formats, how I'm drafting, difficult seats, how I'm playing the games, that is a Patreon reward at certain tiers. I also am very open to answering questions about why I made certain picks or why I made certain plays. So if that's something you're interested in, maybe go check that out. This event history landing page has a few things aside from access to all your drafts. It also has your win rate, so you're across all the Arena games you ever played, your win rate, but also there are filters at the top here. You can set to different formats. So for example, if I filter to Mom, my win rate is 65% instead of my average of 63. So I know, hey, I did better in Mom than I did in an average set, right? So you can look at that kind of stuff. You can also just track hey, today I am winning this much in this format, where 2 weeks ago I was winning this much. So I've either improved or I've gotten worse at the format. That's something that you can track if you're interested in. If you're somebody who has alternate accounts, you can also filter through all the accounts. 17 Lands tracks all of your accounts at the same time. So I have a few alt accounts that I use for Bronze to Mythic, so I get to filter for just that, or just my main account if I want to. And so with all that cursory stuff out of the way, let's look at an actual draft log, and I think what you can gain out of looking at your draft log. So let's just look at one of my recent 7-1 Lord of the Rings decks. Was a pretty good blue-red deck. So I think there are 3 main reasons that you would want to look at a draft log review page like this. Number one, and this is what I use it for almost every single day, when you just want to show a certain pick or the whole draft log to somebody, on Discord or on, Reddit, or give it to a friend that you trust, that, somebody that you feel like is better at Magic than you. This is what patrons send me on the Discord, their draft log, and they just go through and I go, hey, I would have made this pick a little bit different, or this pick, or on your own, you can, when you're showing it to a friend or somebody on Discord or just anybody you trust, you can go, hey, pack 1, pick 4. I started with 3 awesome red cards, and that's what happened in this draft. I went Fear Fire Foes into Smite the Deathless, and then pick 4, I had to pick between Peligre Survivor and Build a Pony. That was a close pick for me. I wasn't quite sure what to do. If you're curious, I took the Peligre Survivor because I like blue-red a lot, and I want to get in blue-red as often as I can. I think this kind of analysis and collaboration I'm describing with other people really gets to the nitty-gritty of improving a draft. If you're looking to get better at draft, this is how. This is the exact precise surgical knife way to do it, because you're getting down to the fundamental questions. When you show somebody this pick and you explain why you made the pick, you get to dive into the logic of what makes sense to you and compare it with, ideally, again, somebody who has more experience in the format, who is better at Magic. Because let's just say you took Build a Pony in this pick instead. Well, I think that would be perfectly fine. I wouldn't disagree with that pick by any means. But I do think it's a slight hit to your win percentage by a little bit. That's why I would take the Peligre Survivor, because in my opinion, if somebody showed me this pick, this is kind of the collaboration and explanation I would give them, is that I think that while Peligre Survivor is a slightly worse card, it goes in a much better deck, right? I think blue-red is quite a bit better than white-red. And questions like this come up all the time in every single draft. I would say in a lot of drafts that I look at, there's like 6 or 7 picks that have interesting questions like this, not just early on, but later on when you figure out, okay, my deck looks like this, you're in pack 3, what exactly does my deck need? Trying to weigh those things. Maybe you're unsure of the balance of, number of cheap cards versus expensive cards. That's the kind of stuff that, those questions come up a lot too. But also what's super valuable is, I would suggest coming to somebody first, asking them, hey, I picked out these 5 picks, what do you think of them? But if, somebody has the time to do it, the absolute best thing is they look at the whole draft log, and they'll probably pick out picks that you might not even have considered as a point of contention or an interesting decision. You're so steadfast in your thought about what you wanted to take that maybe you missed an option, right? And that's something that a second set of eyes is very good at pointing out. So that's the first thing I think going through your old draft logs can really be helpful for. The second thing is, let's not even involve somebody else, right? If you just want to look at your own drafts, and I would recommend doing so, you're going to uncover a few picks, those few picks that you might have shown to somebody else, but you can just ask yourself the question, hey, why did I take this card, right? Maybe identify those 5, 6, 7 picks that were kind of interesting. And while I do think it is better if you can have somebody else look, there's still a lot of value in looking at your own draft picks too. Because what's going to happen a lot of the time is you're going to come to a pick and you're like, why did I make that pick? And you just look back at it in hindsight and you're like, no, I definitely should have made this other decision here. Like in the moment, I made this pick for, for some sort of frivolous reason, but really logically thinking through it, hey, I should have taken card B over card A. You're going to encounter a lot of those. And often what happens is, I have this question here of pack 1, pick 4. What do I take, right? Between Build a Pony and Pelagru Survivor. Well, that pick happens fairly early in the grand scheme of this draft and the games you're playing, right? Like, if you consider when you first click enter draft to when you play your last game of your league here, you're going to have a lot of decisions, a lot of questions, a lot of game actions, a lot of draft picks that come after this, right? And so you might have forgotten that this was an interesting pick, and this might have sent you down a completely different path. So looking at your own draft logs can be just a reminder to be like, oh yeah, that especially if you come off a draft that maybe you were a little bit tilted, you went 2-3, you're like, I don't really want to deal with any of this, and you're just thinking about the last games, how you made a misplay or whatever. This might have been the pick that spiraled out of control and really just snowballed into something that was completely different than another path. So just coming back to this and the ability to come back to this, because if you're not trafficking your own drafts and you're not looking back, there's a very small chance that you would even think about this pick as a point of contention. You're probably more thinking, oh man, in that last game I just didn't punt, or maybe, if I just didn't draw that 14th land in a row or whatever. Your mind is much more focused on the gameplay when a game, draft doesn't go so well. It's gonna really forget about the tricky draft picks a lot of the time, especially the ones early on. So having a record of that's very helpful. And the process when you're going through your own draft log, you're not showing it to somebody else, is pretty similar to if you're preparing it to show it to somebody else. You're going through picking out 6, 7, 8 kind of interesting picks that you're like, hey, I thought about this for a little while, I wasn't sure what to do. Go back and review those. Really think about the logic. I want to really harp on this. Thinking about why you wanted to take card A over card B. And here's where it is definitely an advantage to have a friend or to have somebody looking over. Like, your logic at the time when you were drafting might be different than it was when you go to review, right? You might, again, you're under pressure when you're drafting. You might have just taken a card for a reason that doesn't really hold up under scrutiny when you think about the logic of it. And you get to the draft review and you're like, okay, yeah, that's actually a pick that, given infinite time, I would like to think I would have come to the right logical conclusion, taking card A over card B. But there is a lot of you don't know what you don't know going on here, where there's going to be a lot of picks, like I mentioned before, that you're just going to skim over and not even realize is a pick where you might have been taking something else. So if you can, I do recommend having somebody else look over it. But I do want to really reinforce, there is value still in just your own looking over, finding picks that you're like, hey, I actually, given enough time, I think I would have made a different pick. And the idea is, next time you come across a pick kind of like that, you're going to make the better choice, right? It's almost like when you're presented with a tough pick on Arena, you're asked to do something novel. You're asked to make a choice that you likely haven't had the exact same choice before. You haven't been in the exact same scenario, right? And Arena's asking you, in 40 seconds, make the right choice. But if you had infinite time, you could probably come up with a more informed decision, right? It's almost like if somebody said, hey, you, do a backflip right now. You're like, I don't know if I can. Given infinite time, though, might be difficult, but you probably could, right? So this is almost like this process of going through your own draft logs is almost like that. It's almost like pausing time and training your draft prowess, intuition, and then you get to unpause it And the next time you encounter this situation, right, it's not going to be the exact same draft pick, but the next time you encounter a draft pick that's similar, you have more experience and you have some logic behind it. And the last thing this draft review page can really help you with is you can actually visit it in real time as you're drafting, and it'll update for what picks you have, but also it has a special feature, the known missing feature. And what you can actually do is once you get to the wheel, once you get to pack 1, pick 9, that's the first time this will pop up, it'll actually show you the cards that other people have taken out of the pack so that you don't have to remember, right? And that's very valuable information. If you've listened to previous episodes where I talk about how important it is to understand the wheel and use the wheel and how it can play a big part in figuring out what colors are open, you know it's a pretty big game, right? So being able to not have to remember what your opening pack had and just being able to reference this on 17 lands, it's going to really help. Now, it's a bit of a crutch if you are preparing for like a paper event, certainly. But, you know, if you're not preparing for any paper events and you're just like, hey, like, I don't want to have the stress of remembering what was the top 6 cards in my opening pack. And by the way, if you do want some more thoughts, some more info about using the wheel and reading the wheel, I do have a podcast episode. I think it's episode 82, Top 5 Ways to Read the Wheel. It's both on YouTube and the podcast feed. So you can go check that out if you want more info on this. But yeah, the wheel reading is something that I do this, especially for high-level events. If I'm in the Arena Open Day 2, I will have 17 lands open so that I can have this information in front of me. And then the complementary feature to the draft log review is, of course, the gameplay review. You can find that from any of the events that you've played in. Just click on details, and it'll show you all of the games. It'll show you if you lost or won it. It'll show you how long the game was. It'll show you your matchup. Just click on those and use the arrow key, go forward in your games, and you look at every single turn. And everything I just said about reviewing your draft log, I would apply to looking at the gameplay as well. So you can do some self-analysis. You can do some analysis with a friend. You can post your gameplay log on Discord and be like, hey, what would you have done different here? And the same kind of thing, you can identify a few key plays, a few key turns. You're like, I think this was a point of contention. This was an interesting spot. What would you have done there? And once again, it's likely that if you show this to somebody or a bunch of people, they're going to probably point out spots that you didn't even know were spots that you could have done something different in. Okay, so that is the draft and game replays covered. Now let's get to the other big reason why you'd want to visit 17 lands, and that's, of course, the juicy part of the website, the enticing part, the card performance data. I have a lot to say about this feature, both some opinions on how much you should lean into it versus not lean into it, and of course, how to best use it. For those not in the know, just to explain this a little bit, in tracking its users' games, like we just looked at, 17 lands also collects win rate data of both individual cards and of archetypes. Though, for the moment being, we're just going to talk about the individual cards for now. And then it displays the data in a nice chart where you can just, filter by what are the top commons winning, what are the, the top rares, etc., etc. And if you use this data correctly and use it responsibly, it's a pretty good tool. Actually, I would say it's quite a good tool for understanding baseline evaluations of cards. I talked last week on the card evaluation episode about how important it is to understand the baseline of a card. Just, you put this card in your deck, how well is it going to perform? Like, regardless of anything else, how well will this card do in your deck? And not to say that 17 lands data is exactly that, because there are intervening factors, of course. When you have, for example, in Lord of the Rings, when you have a black card, it's going to be represented a little bit higher because all the black decks are quite good, so black cards in general are going to win more than green cards. But even with a few wrinkles, I do think that the numbers that are provided, they paint a pretty good picture of what you're looking for if you're looking to see what the good cards and not so good cards in a format are. This, of course, raises some questions and some concerns about how much you should be leaning into the data and drafting based on that. So before we get into the actual application, I just want to talk a little bit about how I think you should use the data and my opinion on the data and how useful it is. I think a good way to frame data usage is if you think about two different players, one who always drafted based on just the highest pack. They always just, they opened their pack, they looked on 17 lands, they took the highest win rate card, and they never didn't do that, right? That's one player, that's one extreme. And then, of course, the other extreme is just somebody who never uses 17 lands, never uses the data. I think that there is a happy medium that you should strive for somewhere in the middle. My favorite way that 17 lands data has been described, and this is something that when I was talking with Sam Black the last time he was on the podcast, he described it this way, and I thought it was great. And he said that to him, the 17 lands data is like a good friend, a trustworthy friend that is pretty good at Magic. They have good opinions. They're going to point you in the right direction. They're rarely going to lead you astray, but they don't always have every single piece of context that you do. So for example, you talk to your friend before you go into the draft, you go, hey, friend, 17 lands, what are the best cards in this set? And they can give you a pretty good idea, and they can give you a good idea of the not so good cards and the good archetypes and the not so good archetypes. But will their advice hold steadfast for your draft in particular, for the entire draft? Of course not. You're going to deviate from their recommendations at some point when you're halfway through the draft and, they say card A is better than card B. This 5-drop is better than this 2-drop. But hey, you need a 2-drop. You should take the 2-drop, right? Or it's just like, hey, your friend says, green-black isn't that great of an archetype. It's not one of the archetypes I would try to get into. But in your seat, you open a good green rare, you get past a good black card, and then green-black happens to be really open. Are you not supposed to draft that deck? No, of course not. That's most likely going to be the deck you're supposed to draft. Doesn't mean that your friend, aka 17 lands, is wrong. No, it just means that your friend didn't have the context that you do in the moment. And that is basically how I view the data, just big picture. I see it as you should trust it, you should rely on it, but not blindly. You should put a decent amount of weight on what the data is telling you, but just know that with some critical thinking and with some context and with some nuance, there are going to be draft picks that you make that are going to be different than what 17 lands might suggest you do. And of course, that's a skill too, knowing when to break away from that suggestion, because sometimes you can break away and it's like, no, you should just listen to your good friend. They're very smart at Magic, they know what they're talking about. Don't break away from that unless you have good reason to. And of course, when you're talking about 17 lands data, this discourse, this conversation always comes up of how much should you lean into it? Are people overrating how much you should lean to the data, follow the numbers, believe what it says? If you're somebody who does put a lot of value in what 17 lands has to say, is that making you a worse drafter to some degree? Or you might have the opposite opinion. You might think it's underrated. People should use it and lean into it a little more often. Here's my take on it, and I want to approach this from the perspective I mentioned a few minutes ago, where if you look at somebody who always uses 17 lands when they're drafting, they don't just take the highest game in hand win rate card out of the pack, versus somebody who has never looked at 17 lands before, and this could be somebody who is, quite an experienced player. I think there is some sort of happy medium, and I want to approach this from what I think people on both sides of the spectrum are missing out on. And I do think that the more experienced and the more confident you are in your own Magic and drafting skills, the less you probably have to gain from looking at the 17 lands win rate data. And this isn't to say necessarily that I think there's a minuscule amount to gain from somebody who is pretty experienced, like myself, like Sam Black. It's more to say that I think you have a lot to learn. If you are somebody who is a little bit less experienced, you'll learn a lot, and you'll get a lot of the way by looking at 17 lands data and taking a look at what the good and not so good cards are. I've heard some approach the argument of, okay, well, why would I trust this data? It's, how can I be sure this is coming from good players? It could just be MTGA randoms. Well, my rebuttal to that would be, number one, 17 lands naturally selects for good players, right? If you're invested enough to want to download 17 lands and have it track your data, you're most likely going to be on the more experienced side of things, and that shows in the win rate data, because 17 lands users on average win at like 54, 55, 56% in general on average for a format. Whereas if this was just like a pool of all the players, you would see a win rate closer to 50%, right? So this is implying that the people that use 17 lands that we're getting the data from are experienced to some degree. They know what they're doing. Now, this isn't to say that everybody is, but we're talking aggregates. We're talking averages here. I do think on average, 17 lands players are quite experienced in general. And if that's not convincing enough for you, of course, and we're going to get this when we get into the features, there is a filter you can filter for just the top players. So if you are worried about like, I don't know if I should trust this, you can filter by top players and just get the data from the people that are winning. Like, it's like something like above 60% over the last 4 formats or something. So those are trusted sources of that data. And a final thought I would pose here for folks that might not be 100% convinced is that with how many games of Magic are played these days, by the end of a format, generally an individual card, an individual common, will have a sample size of in the tens of thousands. Sample size is not small in this. Right now, we have a lot of people using 17 lands, and over thousands of games. Yes, you can argue that some players are going to use cards a little bit better than others. There are some people that will put cards in decks more accurately at more appropriate times. There are some people that will put cards in decks at less appropriate times. But in that big of a sample size, you kind of just have to remove the human element from it sometimes. Just be like, hey, when this card was played 20,000 times, this is how well it did. And there are times you can break that. We're going to get into that. A single stat of game in hand win rate isn't going to tell the full story, but it tells a lot. Like, I think you should really put a lot of weight on just the raw sheer number of games that are being played and how that reflects how a card will do on average in a given game. And I know I said final thought, but I have one more thought on this. Another way to look at this is the pro testing teams that are testing for the Pro Tour, teams that people have top 8'd the Pro Tour that they've been on, they use 17 lands data. And this isn't to say that they're using it as a pick order, but they're referencing it for exactly what I'm advocating referencing it for. Rough power level and noting when cards are a little bit better or a little bit worse than you might assume. So if it's good enough for pros, I think it should be good enough for the average player. And of course, there's the other side of the coin, and where might people overrated? There's that player that always uses 17 lands. They're just drafting by, like paint by numbers, drafting by numbers in some ways. Well, my experience is that, from talking to players just like of all skill levels, my experience is that people that are on that end of the spectrum, they really lean into 17 lands when trying to make draft picks. It's not that they think that that's optimal to do. The vast majority of players know that there's more drafting than just drafting by numbers. It's more that I think that when you're unsure of how good cards are, you should lean into it, and then eventually, once you get better at drafting, once you get better at card evaluation, you break away from it a little more, because then, when you understand why certain cards are good in certain places, you can make your own judgments, you can make your own calls, you know more accurately and more reliably why a card might be good in a certain place. You don't have to rely on the aggregate data. You can use your own nuance and context-driven card evaluations. All right, so that's the opinion stuff out of the way. Just before we get into some application and talking about what metrics are the most important, I do have a bit of a list of things you should know before we talk about that stuff. Things you should know about the data in general. So number one, I just mentioned a second ago, but we're working with averages. All of the numbers, all of the input, we're going to be talking about the average case scenario. The data is going to reflect how most people are using the card. And this has a few ramifications. Number one, I think it means that you should trust the data on cards that are performing well. And then the flip side we're going to get to in a second is you should question the data a little bit more for cards that aren't performing very well. There's a bit of variability, a bit of flexibility, but it's really, really difficult for a bad card to show up as a top common, for example. If there was a card that you're not expecting to be a top common, or you don't expect, hey, that card looked pretty good, but not as good as, the second or first best common, it's likely that you're missing something, not that there's something kind of funky going wrong in the data. A good example of this, Preening Champion, right? Preening Champion, we now know after playing Mom that was top common, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, enter the battlefield, make a 1/1 blue and red elemental creature token. As the format went on, people went, yeah, okay, this card is awesome. But the first week of the format, I really did have to kind of harp on this card being like, yes, this card is excellent for a variety of reasons. Same thing with Chimney Rabble, right? Chimney Rabble from Phyrexia, all would be one. This was another card. This was the top common in that format. And this card, kind of the same thing. People looked at it, it's like, yeah, it looks pretty good, but we've seen cards kind of like this. Turns out that haste is a big deal, right? And this turned into the top common. Turns out making multiple bodies is a big deal, right? And that is, something that we talked about last week on last week's episode of the card evaluation episode. Lunarch Veteran. Here's another good one. Single white mana for a 1/1. When another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life, and it has Disturb for 1 and a white, which means you can cast it from your graveyard, and the backside is a 1/1 flyer that whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life. This is a card that, in Midnight Hunt, was a top-performing common, and the data said so, said as such. And a lot of people kind of had trouble kind of understanding that, going, okay, I don't understand how this 1 mana 1/1 gains a little bit of life, comes back, like, why is this top performing common? And a lot of people were to the point where they just didn't believe it. They were like, no, there must be something wrong in the data. There's no way. Well, it turns out that with Lunarch Veteran, starting the game at like a virtual 27 life is pretty good. Turns out that having a piece of material to sacrifice that you can cast again from the graveyard is pretty good. Turns out when there's a bunch of self-mill, Disturb cards for the cheap Disturb costs are pretty good. So my point here is that even though there are cards that might not immediately stand out as, oh yeah, this card is awesome, you should trust the cards that are performing well, because since there is such a large sample size and people are going to put it in their deck, even when maybe it's not the perfect deck for it and the cards are still performing well on average, that just tells you there's something there that you might be missing. A way I've heard is described as the good cards are idiot-proof, quote-unquote. Like, you can give the cards to a monkey, right? They choose 40 cards, and if Lunarch Veteran or Chimney Rabble or Preening Champion gets into their deck randomly, just like, you ask the monkey to hand you cards, well, that card's gonna be pretty good regardless of the other 39 cards that they hand you, as long as, you can cast it to give you enough planes or islands to cast your Lunar Veterans or Printing Champions respectively, right? And I do want to be careful not to oversell this too much, because sometimes a common is a top common in a format, not because of its individual value, although, that's going to play a part of it, but because of how it interacts with the other cards in the format. So maybe a more accurate way of describing the monkey situation is saying, you ask a monkey to hand you 40 cards of a particular format, so that even if they do give you a Lunar Veteran, well, it's going to be playing well with all the other cards in that pile. You're not going to get randomly handed cards from like an Infect set where life gain might not matter as much, for example. That idea really was awakened in the community's collective conscious in what I'm calling the Vampire Spawn moment. And for those who don't know, Vampire Spawn is a card from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms from 2 years ago, the D&D set, and it's 2 and a black for a 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. Before this set, and before we saw the data for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, I think the community, good players, medium players, just as a wholesale, doesn't matter who you were, underrated this effect as being a good effect, this drain effect. You gain some life, they lose some life. I think we kind of looked at it like, it's like this incidental thing, this like 3 mana 2/3. It's not that good of a card. And what happened was Vampire Spawn for the first week of the format, or the second week, because actually we didn't have the Adventure of the Forgotten Realm data for the first week of the format. There's something funky going on in 17 lands. But on the second week of the format, when the data actually came out, this was one of the highest winning commons. And we kind of were like, oh, that's kind of weird. Is that, just like I was saying a second ago, some people were like, oh, is that like a weird anomaly in the data? Is there something going on here? And we just realized that, no, for years, people have just been underrating this effect. There was a card in Zendikar Rising, Malakir Blood Priest. This was 1 and a black for a 2/1 that when it entered the battlefield, it drained your opponent for your party members. So if you had like a warrior and a wizard, you get this Vampire Spawn effect, you gain 2, they lose 2. And at the time of Zendikar Rising, people thought that was a good card, but not like, a top common by any means. And it just so happened that when Zendikar Rising came back online and we actually got data, when Zendikar Rising first came out, we actually didn't have 17 lands data looking at, it wasn't tracking the win rate data. But when it came back on flashback, and you can now see the top commons, Malakir Blood Priest is the top common. So the presence of Vampire Spawn and it performing so well, almost is just like new understanding, this new card evaluation tool we unlocked of, oh, this drain effect is actually good. And that's bore itself out through other cards that we've seen since Vampire Spawn. So this is a definitive point to say that I think that there is something very much to be learned from 17 lands, the Vampire Spawn moment being something that just stuck in my head that really solidify that for me. And it's also a very good example of what I was just talking about a second ago of just trusting the top performing commons, because they're usually telling you something that you're not even aware of about the format or about the card in general. So that's the easy part. That's the good cards. The button to put on it is, most of the time, if a card is putting up good numbers, if it is, high on the list of top commons, top uncommons, top rares, whatever it is, it's pretty safe to say it's a good card. Put it in your deck, it's going to do well. The other side of the equation, the not so good cards, here's where it gets a little trickier, because when you put a good card, a generically good card in your deck, once again, you go through the monkey test, right? The monkey that's always going to put it in the right deck, because there's no wrong deck mostly for the good cards, right? When you get to cards that are not performing so well or are performing less well than you might expect, that means that either the card is not good, like it's just a card that you should never play, there's no situation that it's going to be good in. But the tricky part is sometimes there are cards that aren't going to perform well in the aggregate, but will perform well in specific decks, right? Again, we're dealing with averages here, and if the average player is putting the card that they think is good in their deck, but it's not the right deck for it, then of course that card is going to, in the aggregate data, not perform particularly well. Really good example, I was talking last week about Otherworldly Gaze, the single blue mana instant that basically mills 3 cards, and then it has flashback for 1 and a blue. Last week I was saying how in Midnight Hunt, this is a playable card if you've got enough flashback and disturb cards in your graveyard, so that you're virtually drawing them by milling yourself for 3. You draw a few cards off of this thing. But if somebody were just to put this card in an average blue deck, it would be quite bad. And I imagine, people are trying out cards, people are learning the format. At the beginning of the format, you're going to have more people playing wrong cards in the wrong deck. And this also, here's a caution I will say about 17 lands. Here's one thing that I do think you have to be careful of. There is sometimes a negative feedback loop that happens when you've got a card like Otherworldly Gaze, where because it's not performing well, good players, they look at 17 lands and say, oh, I shouldn't play that card, and they don't play it, and then it never actually goes in the deck that it should belong in. A deck with 10 plus flashback or disturb cards. And so you do run into this danger sometimes as a player of compartmentalizing cards into good or bad, when really a lot of the times it's good, generically good. You don't need work to make this card good, and hey, this card isn't good in a vacuum, but does actually have a home where it's going to perform, and the 17 lands data won't actually show you that, right? Unless you are able to filter it to such a granular degree, and I would say for Otherworldly Gaze, there's no feature right now in 17 lands where I can see decks with 10, 11, 12 cards that Otherworldly Gaze can bin in the graveyard that I would like to bin. Because you can't see that data, you never actually see where Otherworldly Gaze is good and how it's going to perform in a deck that is actually good for it. Another example of this kind of card, a more recent example, is Nasty End from Lord of the Rings. 1 and a black for an instant, sacrifice a creature, additional cost to cast this card, you draw 2 cards, and if the sacrificed creature was legendary, you draw 3 cards instead. If you look at the aggregate data on 17 lands, this card is not performing particularly well. In fact, it's one of black's worst commons. But in a deck with, you've got maybe 10 legends or tempting cards, it becomes a playable card. Right now, like, if you're to map on the 17 lands win rate to a letter grade, it's probably winning at about like a D- level in the aggregate. But I imagine a lot of people are just putting it in their black decks, right? Where I would want to have a deck with, again, 10 cards that I can sacrifice. Maybe you have like a Golem, Patient Plotter, which is a really good thing to sacrifice to this thing. And then it's going to be maybe more of a C or a C+ level card. That's another thing you have to consider too. That it's not only just, oh, I've identified where this card goes. Otherworldly Gaze and a deck with a lot of flashback disturb cards. Nasty and a deck with a lot of legends and tempting cards. Sometimes people will put these cards into decks that, if you understand when they should play them, like the cards that they want to surround themselves with to make these cards playable, but sometimes people don't have the threshold of cards that make them playable, right? You can imagine somebody being like, oh, I've heard that Otherworldly Gaze is good with flashback and disturb cards, and they put it in their deck with 4 or 5 of them. Same with Nasty End. Maybe they put it in a deck with 4 or 5 legend or temp cards, and the card is just not going to perform that well. So this is why I say this is more complicated. It's definitely a bit more nuanced. The bad cards, the cards that are not performing very well, have room to be good in the right deck. But here's where I really will caution. The onus is on you to really be confident that your quote-unquote bad card is doing a good thing in your deck. Because you have to ask yourself, what am I doing that everybody else isn't, that makes this card good for me and not for everybody else? And you have to be pretty confident about that, right? There's a trap you can fall into where you think a card is good, you put it in your deck, you see that, on 17 lands, hey, this card's not performing that well, and you go, oh, well, people are just using it wrong. I'm sure people are just putting it in the wrong deck. Well, maybe, but are you so confident that tens of thousands of other people are getting this really, really wrong, or at least the majority of tens of thousands of other people are getting this wrong? Maybe you do feel that way. But you have to be pretty confident about that, right? I think too often people just hand wave and go, oh, no. I know this card is good. My intuition tells me it's good, but people are just playing it wrong. Could be true, but that's a trap that you have to dance around, right? It's kind of you have to be honest with yourself. You have to really be putting it to the test, not just hand wave it away. And this leads nicely into another point I have here, and that's when a card is performing poorly, especially a card that you might have expected to do a little bit better. You read the cards before you played the set. First week, maybe you put that card that read pretty good to you in your deck, and you're like, okay, let's see how this plays. Maybe it plays okay for you. And then after a week, you look at the data and you're like, oh, this card's actually like way worse than I expected, or it's performing way worse than I expected it to. When that happens, you should put on your detective hat. And this is what I do. Whenever there's a card that I expect that is going to be, pretty solid and isn't performing very well, I ask why. And like I just mentioned, sometimes the answer you come to is, oh no, I am confident that I am playing this card in the right spot, and the majority of people aren't, right? That might be a conclusion you come to. But I will tell you, most of the time, that's not the conclusion I come to when I experience this, when there's a card that I think is going to be pretty good and ends up not being that good. And what I do instead is my first go-to is I challenge my baseline for the card that I expected to be pretty good. Here's a good example. Alabaster Host Intercessor for March of the Machine. This is the 5 and a white, 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Alabaster Host Intercessor leaves the battlefield. It's got plain cycling too. Okay, so when we first saw this card, when it's first previewed, I think a lot of people were very excited about it, myself included. I think in my set review, I gave it like a B-. I remember on the Limited Resources set review, I'm pretty sure they gave it a B- too. Reads like a pretty good card. I played the card a few times in the early days of the format and was not so impressed with it. I was less impressed than I expected it to be. And then I went, okay, let's go check out 17 Lands. And sure enough, 17 Lands did not have this as a particularly well-performing card. I believe it was performing worse than an average common. Like, this is below the 50% mark for commons. And this is where you can get to the real nitty-gritty. And this is where I actually started my journey of figuring out the format a little bit better. When one of the big points, if you remember, for March of the Machine, one of my big points was removal is everywhere, right? There's just a ton of removal running around. And hey, Alabaster Host Intercessor, these creatures that, you know, these like exile something until they leave, you really hope that this thing doesn't see a removal spell. You really hope your opponent doesn't untap and just kill it, because then they get their creature back, right? And so when I realized, oh, this isn't this card necessarily, although, you know, I think that 6 mana for this effect is more than you'd like to pay. I think this actually plays better on a cheaper card, because when you play something like an Annex Entry, like a 3 mana 1/4, where this exile something until it leaves ability, well, that really disrupts your opponent's tempo, or really disrupts their curve if they want to kill your creature. You know, by the time you cast Alabaster Host Intercessor as a 6-drop, they probably don't have that much more they want to do with their mana, so if they have a removal spell, it doesn't really set them back. But it put me down this path of, oh, people just have a ton of removal in this format. It's just par for the course. You shouldn't expect your expensive creatures to survive very often, and that makes Alabaster Host Intercessor a lot worse. And that kind of discovery, that kind of detective work is something I do a lot, right? When I'm looking at stats, I can kind of go reverse engineer. There's a danger here too, right? I want to warn you. You can definitely come up with some false pretenses and, you know, like go down these paths of like, oh, I think this is true about the format because of this card and it's not doing so well, and this is the story I'm telling myself. Again, you have to be reasonably confident that this is true, and you have a hypothesis, you test it out. But that was my hypothesis, and it ended up being pretty true for the format, that you didn't want to play expensive creatures that were susceptible to removal spells because there was a million of them running around. So this is the mindset I really want to encourage. Really challenge your baselines first. Don't just go, hey, I read the card, I thought it was pretty good, and 17 Lines is telling me something else. Whatever, I'll still play it. Ask yourself. You'll find a lot out about the format or about the card you're looking at. And it's a very fun exercise, at least for me. I mean, I have a lot of fun doing this, going like, hey, that card looks pretty good. Let me challenge my assumption. And not only is that like a practical way to use 17 lands, but it also is going to help you as your development as a Magic player, as a card evaluator. And one last thought I want to touch on before we get into the application of how to actually dive into the data is I just want to put forth this notion that the data doesn't lie, right? Data can never tell a lie. It's always gonna just be numbers. Data can only be either one, misinterpreted, or a little bit less likely, it could be a faulty collection of the data, right? There are some examples of that I want to point out. But when there is a number, like the data, it's always gonna tell you something. That something is what you have to figure out. And you know, you come to a little bit of level ups. I'll tell you a lot of that something when it does come down to it. You know, if you were looking for that info, usually I am looking to explain the kind of weird cards here and there. But I just want to really put forth that the numbers aren't being fudged somehow, right? I just wanted to kind of dispel this as a myth. There's no funny business going on most of the time. Now here's where I say most of the time, because I do want to point out a few tricky things. So cards that you don't actually draw them, like lesson cards from Strixhaven or companions, those are tricky because 17 Lands actually doesn't track those cards in a way that's very helpful. If you remember correctly, Expanded Anatomy was one of the top commons on 17 Lands data for Strixhaven. Turns out that, yes, that card's going to be excellent because you can tutor it whenever you want to. So you're only going to draw it when it's good. Okay, so that's where the numbers are quote-unquote lying to you a little bit, right? And you can't tell the difference between Lutri as a companion and Lutri as a not a companion, because when you put Lutri into your hand, you're choosing to do it at an opportune time. You never draw Lutri, quote-unquote draw Lutri or any other companion when you don't want to, right? So there's a little bit of obscuring of some numbers there. The other weird thing, and this is one from pretty recent memory that can sometimes be weird. So in Dominaria United, Shield Wall Sentinel, 4-mana artifact, 1/3 defender. It's a wall. When it enters the battlefield, you look for your library for a defender. This was the top performing common for a long time. The reason, of course, is because it always or very often went to get the Wingmantle Chaplain. So this is kind of like a proxy for Wingmantle Chaplain. If you draft Shield Wall Sentinel as the top common, obviously you're not going to do very well if you don't have the Wingmantle Chaplain in your deck, right? But with the Wingmantle Chaplain, Shield Will Sentinel probably does become the common you most want to see, right? So there's always some unraveling to do, right? The numbers are just going to be there. Again, you're the one who has to kind of put on your detective hat if you're willing to dig in. And I'm not suggesting everybody does that. No, but not everybody has to do this. I'm just saying if you're interested, basically, right? If you're somebody who does want to get to that next level, wants to really dig in, why is X happening in the format? Why is this card doing well? Why is it not? Why is this card that looks very strange and out of place performing in a place that I wouldn't expect it to? Okay, so I know that was a lot to cover before getting to the actual application. When you get on the website, what are you looking for? But I do think it's really important to understand all the things I talked about previously so that you can responsibly use the data and so you can also understand a little bit better what's going on. Okay, so you get onto 17 lands and you go, all right, what am I supposed to be looking for? Where is this card data? Well, you go to the top of the page, there's this analytics tab, you click card data, it brings you to this gigantic chart. It's just like, you know, a chart with every single card in the format. There's 12 columns across. There's all these numbers and letters. It can be very overwhelming. So let's talk about these metrics. Let's talk about what you actually want to look for when you're trying to evaluate cards. So there's a lot of filters you can put on your cards here. I've just currently sorted by just the commons. You can look at archetypes. You can look, you know, how well certain cards are performing in certain archetypes versus other ones. I'm just looking at the commons, and I've ordered by what I believe is the most all-encompassing, least biased metric, which is game in hand win rate. There's a lot of metrics here that you can look at. Improvement when drawn, opening hand win rate. But game in hand win rate is the gold standard. It's the least biased metric. It's the one that if you're just looking for a quick, like, hey, how well is this card performing in X format and Y format? You can just take a look at it. This metric is the one that just says, have you seen this card at any point in the game? Was it in your opening hand? Did you draw it? You know, there's a stat that just tracks opening hand. There's a stat that just tracks when you've drawn it, not in your opening hand. Game in hand win rate is just, hey, did you see this card in the game? And I believe this is the least biased and the most useful metric for most of the time. One metric will not tell this full story, but this one tells a lot of the story. So when I use 17 lands, that's what I do. I'm just saying, okay, like, you know, say it's the first week of the format, and I'm like, all right, what are the top commons after 5 days of collecting data? And I just go sort by common, click the game in hand win rate, that'll organize it. And then you can go, you know, if you really wanted to, you could sort by top users, like I mentioned. You can sort by color just to make it easier. You just want to say like, okay, what are the top white commons, for example? And honestly, if you just did that, if you just sorted by game in hand win rate, you would get a lot of the way there. I believe you would get, you know, 80% there without looking at the other metrics, although the other metrics are important too. By the way, just to explain some of the percentages here, Claim the Precious currently has a game in hand win rate of 61.8%. So again, that just means if Claim was in your opening hand, or if you've drawn it at some point in the game, on average, people win 61.8% when that happens. And that's just like a percentage number. Like, you're like, what does that mean? What am I comparing it to? Well, what you can do is if you go to, again, analytics and go to the deck color data, that'll show you a breakdown of the archetypes that are winning. We're going to get to this in a second, but if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see all decks, which of course means that's the overall average win rate for 17 lands players in this format, and for Lord of the Rings, that's 55.6. So you compare the average win rate of 55.6 to 61.8. Well, that means that Claim the Precious is winning, you know, a good 6% more than the average card in the format would. And that's big. By the way, I want to say every percentage point, like that's a good notch. Like a percentage point is like a letter, like a fraction of a letter grade, right? Like C to C plus, C plus to B minus, if you're trying to map it onto like the limited resources style grading system. Let's look at another metric. So there's opening hand win rate, and this is a good metric if you're looking to see how well an aggro card will perform, because you care about the cards in your opening hand more than you care about anything else generally. Like your aggro decks are very much live or die by how good their opening hand is. And if you sort by opening hand win rate for Lord of the Rings, you'll actually see that Rally at the Hornburg, that's winning more than Claim the Precious. And that makes sense to me, right? Like something that is a threat on turn 2 is going to be better than a removal spell early in the game. Unless you're a particularly controlling deck, you don't actually want to draw your removal spells in your opening hand. In an ideal world, you draw your threats first, and then you go, oh, removal, kill your blocker, I'm on board, I've developed my board, and now I'm just top decking removal spells and getting your blockers out of the way. It's much worse, again, unless you're a very controlling deck, to have like 3 Smite the Deathlesses in your hand rather than 3 Rally the Hornburgs. You much rather have 3 Rally the Hornburgs. So if you're evaluating aggro cards, opening hand win rate can be quite useful. Another metric that is useful yet flawed is IWD, which is improvement when drawn. And I know a lot of people think that this is actually the gold standard for this. This is the metric you should look at. I pretty firmly believe it's not. I pretty firmly believe there's a lot of biases that go into this. The problem with IWD, well, there's quite a few problems. Number one, it's going to be biased against aggro cards, right? Because improvement when drawn is basically just like, okay, well, as the game goes on, the cards that are good as the game goes on, when I draw them, they're going to be better, right? I'm gonna if I draw a 6-drop on turn 6, that's good for me, right? Aggro cards are naturally biased against that because the longer the game goes on, the more cards you draw, the more cards you see, the more likely it is that you are just to be losing the game because aggro decks, they want to play a short game, right? So improvement when drawn isn't going to tell you as much because, hey, when you draw your rally on turn 7, maybe it's going to be okay. But turn 7 is not the state of the game that the aggro deck expects to be in or is trying to optimize its cards for, right? So basically, like, the more of a grindy late game card it is, the better the improvement when drawn is going to be. And the opposite is true, of course, for the opening hand win rate. The more of an aggro card, the more that makes sense. And you can use these, right? These are still useful stats. Game in hand win rate gives you the average, a lot of the averages, but opening hand is more useful in the situation where you're trying to figure out, hey, is this red aggro 2-drop good? Or, if you're trying to figure out, hey, is this a good late game card? How good is it when I draw in the late game? Well, improvement when drawn, that can help you a little bit there. The other thing that improvement when drawn is good at distilling is distilling the kind of like raw power of a card divorced from the cards around it. So what I mean by that is, generally, and this is another big picture tip about 17 lands, a rising tide floats all boats, basically. So a black card in Lord of the Rings, because black is so good, is going to have a higher win rate than it might normally if the other black cards that weren't around it weren't good. Because, hey, you put black cards in your black decks with all the other black cards, maybe if that one black card isn't as good, it's still going to be okay, right? It's still going to have a pretty high win rate because all the other cards around it are going to perform well, and maybe that one card's not going to be that big of a deal. So what this means is if you filter, for example, for black-red, which is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck in the format, you're going to see a lot of just generically good game-in-hand win rates across the board, right? Again, a rising tide floats all the ships and makes all the black and red cards in this deck a little bit better. So if you go down to, we're going to scroll all the way down, game-in-hand win rate of a card like Morgul Knife Wound. Not a particularly strong card. This is actually quite a bad card. But it's got a game-in-hand win rate of 56%. And if you remember, that's higher than the average win rate in the format. So that might lead you to believe, oh, hey, this card's actually pretty good, or at least it's a little bit better than average. What you want to look at is the improvement when drawn, because this distills it from the rest of the deck. Its improvement when drawn is -0.3. So it's actually not a card you're going to want to play very often in your black-red deck. It's probably going to be a card you want to avoid. This, of course, works the other way, too, if you want to distill how good a green card is, because, the green cards are going to bring down the other green cards. You can look at its IWD instead, because if you're trying to compare the top green common to the top black common, just by looking at game-in-hand win rate, you're not going to be able to paint that great of a picture for yourself, because the top green common's game-in-hand win rate in range short is only 56%. And, of course, that, again, the data doesn't lie. It is winning it that much. But if you're just trying to say, like, okay, what's the top green common? And how much worse is it than, the top, some of the black commons? It's better to look at IWD. Because you actually see, you don't get that interference of, oh, you put Shorn and Pathfinder. Well, sometimes people put Mushroom Watchdogs in their deck. Or some people, put Brandywine Farmer in their deck if you want to get extreme. That's going to bring the card down. Look at IWD, that'll distill it a little bit further. A few other things with IWD cards that are build-arounds tend to have high improvement when drawn. IWD, because of course you built your whole deck around it. When you draw it, your deck's gonna perform pretty well. It's gonna perform better generally if you didn't draw that card. And just a quick little case study here. I want to look at Gandalf Sanctions, which is the one blue-red sorcery that deals damage to a creature where X number of instant sorcery cards in your grave, and then the rest of the damage tramples over. Game-in-hand win rate for this card, 61.9%. So again, remember, this means that if it's in your opening hand or you've drawn it at some point, it's the collection of the two, you on average win at 61%. Okay, well, let's look at its opening hand win rate. Not particularly good compared to its game-in-hand win rate. Its opening hand win rate is 54%. That's actually really bad, and it makes sense. Sanction doesn't do anything in your opening hand. You want to draw it later. But what's this IWD? What's this improvement when drawn? It's pretty high, right? When you draw it later, 7.6. That's pretty darn good. And again, this is really for the folks that want to dive into the data a little bit deeper. I really do want to reinforce the game-in-hand win rate is gonna get you a lot of the way there. If these numbers are like going over your head and you're spacing out and you're like, okay, maybe I'll come back, listen to this later. Don't worry about it unless you're really interested in diving in. And you know, if you really are confused or you want a second opinion, you know, of course, you know, you can always ask somebody like myself on my Twitch stream or on Discord or something that has a little bit more experience with this. If you just want the quick and dirty answer, look at game in hand win rate. The last metric I want to talk about, and this one's going to come up in a second when I talk about some additional features you can use on 17 lands, is ALSA, A-L-S-A. This stands for average last seen at. And this is the stat that tells you, on average, here's the last draft pick, so on average, you know, 5th pick, 6th pick, that you will see this card. For example, Claim the Precious has an ALSA of 2.32. It gets picked relatively highly. That makes a lot of sense. And you might ask yourself, okay, well, why does this matter? It matters because where a card gets picked actually has a effect on how well it will perform. Because if there's a card that is not performing particularly well, but gets taken very highly, well, that's a card that's going to perform even worse than it might normally. Like, if there's a card that should be, quote-unquote, picked around, you know, 7, 8, and people are picking it first and second, those people that are taking it early are paying a higher draft price, a higher draft pick, where they could be taking a better card, right? There's an opportunity cost there. And that means that that card will perform even worse, because where they could have been taking a good card to make their card deck a little bit better, they're taking a card that's not actually that good, but still spending a high price. The opposite is true too. If there's cards that you know were undervalued, and you can get them late, and you don't have to take them early, even though they're winning quite a bit, well, that just means that there's some value for you to be had there, right? You get a little bit of something by knowing that card goes late, but it's still a good card. Okay, so those are the metrics I'm going to cover today. There's a few, you know, 5 or 6 other kind of more niche ones that I don't use that much personally, and so I don't think they're going to be as useful for the average person. Now let's get into how to actually apply this and how to translate all this information into picking better cards. So the number one thing that I think will help you win more when you're using 17 lands is just noting cards that you wouldn't have expected to be as high in the game in hand win rate or as low as you would have expected, right? That's going to illuminate some of the cards that you're like, oh, I might be a little bit too high on this card, or I might be a little bit too low on this card. That's the number one way I use it. Like, that's what I find most useful. That's how I can be alerted to some of the cards in the format that might have just, you know, slipped under the radar, or, like I was describing before, cards that I expected to perform well, but ended up not. And that's going to get you a lot of the way there, because playing the good cards instead of playing the bad cards will win you a lot of games of limited Magic. That's the quick and easy. If that's all the depth you're looking to get out of 17 lands, that's a lot. You're gonna get a lot from just that. However, if you do want a slightly better and deeper understanding of the format, what you can do, rather than just look, okay, these cards are performing well, you know, noting individual cards, like this one's good, this, you know, these are the top 3 commons or whatever, you can ask what story the top commons and uncommons, or whatever you're filtering by, what story do those cards tell, right? So if you're in a format where you're filtering by game in hand win rate and all the top commons are the cheap efficient 2-drops, well, that probably means in your draft you're going to want to also prioritize cheap efficient cards, maybe higher than you were. If instead the rampy and the grindy cards are doing very well, then maybe that tells you something about the format. Maybe it tells you you should be leaning into late game decks a little more, making sure you have a late game plan. It's very rarely going to be black or white, one or the other. There's going to be some aggro cards in slower formats and some grindy cards that are good in the aggro format. It's not always going to be super clean cut, but you do start to kind of just uncover this picture, right? For example, for Lord of the Rings, the story that was painted to me, that when I was looking through the data, is that all of the tempting cards were higher than I expected them to be, at least compared to how I thought they would perform before playing with the cards. Like, the first week of the format, I came in actually a little bit low on tempting, if you remember. And after, you know, a week or two, I was like, okay, you know, I'm coming up on it a little bit. And then I checked the data and did that search, and I was like, oh, you know what? Like, this Relentless Rohirrim, just a 4-mana 4/3 that tempts you. Hey, that card's one of Red's better commons. Another example is Breaking of the Fellowship. Breaking of the Fellowship, the clunky red tempting removal spell, that's a card that I think for the first week and a half of the format, I was like, oh, I probably just, you know, now I would really hope not to play this card. But after, you know, just like playing it a time or two, seeing it played against me, look up the stats on 17 lands, it had a pretty good game in hand win rate, I believe. It was like 57, which is about a C level card. And then I, you know, immediately, I didn't want to fall into the trap of, oh, okay, well, that's just a good card. Just looking at game in hand win rate, I went to, oh, no, red and black are very good. So I need to also check the IWD, the improvement when drawn, to make sure that it's not just being propped up, being inflated by all the other good red cards. And no, it actually turned out it had a relatively positive IWD. So that's the kind of detective work you can do if you do want to go a little bit deeper. You can also not just do this for a format as a whole, but you can just filter by deck, right? You go like, okay, what does a black-green deck in this format want, right? Or what does a blue-white deck in this format want? You sort by the commons, you sort by the uncommons. You see, like, this is a very useful tool to be able to just, as you're drafting even, you come up to a draft pick and you're like, okay, I'm in pack 3, I know I'm blue-white. What's going to be better, Birthday Escape or Errant Rider of Gondor? Well, you check on 17 lands, you filter by blue-white, you look at common, and, you know, looks like Birthday Escape is a pretty clear winner there. Oh, and one interesting wrinkle, now that we're talking about archetype data, is that when you find a card that is performing a little bit better than you might expected, what I do is I check to see how it's performing, not just in the aggregate, right? Not just on the main page when you just go to the card data and you go game and hand win rate. I do filter by each of the archetypes to see how well it's performing in each individual archetype. This is a very good way to uncover quote-unquote secret gold cards, cards that are kind of only good in one color pair. One of my favorite examples of this is in Crimson Vow, and there was the card Pointed Discussion. Pointed Discussion is 2 and a black for a sorcery at common. You draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life, and you create a blood token. Okay, so it's a card draw spell, you lose 2 life, make a blood token, nice little upside, but draw 2, lose 2s, those generally are not a particularly good card. This was one of the top 15, I think, commons in the format. Yeah, one of the top 15 cards in the format in the aggregate. And that's a little bit strange. And if you just look at the game and hand win rate without looking at the archetype data, seeing how it performs in black-red versus white-black versus green-black, you might just come to the conclusion that, hey, Pointed Discussion is just a good card, right? You should just put this in your black decks. It's got a 56.4 game and hand win rate, which was, you know, pretty solid for Crimson Vow. And that wasn't the case at all. This actually was not a very good card outside of white-black in particular. And if you filter by white-black, you'll see that it's one of the top commons in white-black. It was winning at 59 game and hand win rate. And that just means that in all the other 3 decks, it was winning at like 53 or something, right? It was so good in white-black because you had life gain to offset the life loss from this draw 2 that loses you 2 life. It was doing so well in white-black that it was just skyrocketing its aggregate win rate. So do you have to be careful about that? You can definitely put some wrong cards into the wrong deck if you're not filtering by archetype data. So that covers the majority of what you're going to get out of 17 lands. Just to close out here, I want to share a few additional features that I found helpful that you might find kind of interesting. If you go to analytics up here, there's a lot of interesting tabs, not just the card data. Number 1, of course, is deck color data, which just tells you archetype win rates, which is something that you might want to know when you're trying to figure out what the better decks in the format are. Another interesting feature is the draft metagame feature, and what this tracks is the average last CNETs of just every card in the format, and you can filter by, just like when you're looking at the card data, you can filter by color, you can filter by common, uncommon, rare, and this lets you know where people start to value cards a little bit higher. So let's go to blue. I think blue's probably gonna have some. Yeah, here's one. Birthday Escape. Beginning of the format, you can see on the graph here, people are taking it around 5th pick. And then as the format went on and on, people just taking it higher and higher and higher and higher. This is a really good way of just quickly looking at the cards that are overvalued and undervalued in a format. You know, what cards people are drafting higher. You know, people sometimes ask me, oh, how do you get a good gauge on the meta, right? The meta game. This is one of the better tools, this draft metagame tool, because it lets you know where on average people are taking individual commons or individual uncommons on a given week of a format. There's also a tab for trophy decks. It just like logs all of the most recent trophy decks. So you can look at the color pairs, you can look at their draft, you can look at their deck. Final thing that I want to show you here is the player behavior data, and this is your individual data. What this will do is it'll show you where you are, how much you're mulliganing, how much you're splashing, how much you're playing your pick 1, pack 1, and it plots that against all the other players and says, hey, maybe if you're mulliganing too much, it'll tell you that. If you're mulliganing not enough, it'll tell you that, right? Just based on comparing that to players that win a lot, how much they do that. And that's all I got this week. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you made it this far, go check out that Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups if you're interested. Next week, we got a guest on. Speaking of data, we got Sirkovitz. So if you have any data-minded questions for Sirkovitz, please feel free to either ask me or Sirkovitz on Twitter, on my Discord, anywhere. Should be a fun show. All right, see you next week, everybody.